Welcome to Exploring AI Matters. This podcast series, previously known as Mind the Gap, Dialogues on Artificial Intelligence, will continue to appear in the ABA series to the extent that. In addition, all of the episodes, old and new, will now appear under our new podcast name, Exploring AI Matters. Thank you.
National security is a complex topic for Australia, situated at the edge of Southeast Asia, an increasingly contested trade and security space. The Royal Australian Air Force has recently demonstrated leadership in the development of AI-augmented, uncrewed aircraft. Technological change is both a blessing and a curse in this environment. Successful adoption of new technology can confer substantial advantages, but cost and complexity make success anything but certain. Defense procurement processes struggle with rapidly evolving technologies. These next-generation systems are so expensive and so critical that nations demand strong governance in acquiring them and keeping them current. Artificial intelligence promises great benefits for national security, but the challenge is how to adapt this technology to sophisticated weapon systems. Welcome to Mind the Gap Dialogues on Artificial Intelligence. I am Roland Trope, a national security lawyer.
And I'm Charles Palmer, a computer scientist. We are your hosts for this episode of Mind the Gap, Dialogues on Artificial Intelligence.
In addition, we have two more hosts.
Hello, I'm Alma Adams, a national security lawyer.
And I'm Mark Donner, a computer scientist.
Each episode will be led by two of us, with the others adding impromptu questions and comments as the spirit moves them. In this episode of Mind the Gap, Dialogues on Artificial Intelligence, we will be talking with an accomplished leader in the national security arena. Air Vice Marshal John Blackburn retired from the Royal Australian Air Force in 2008 as the Deputy Chief of the Air Force, following a career as an FA-18 fighter pilot, test pilot, and strategic planner. He served a further 11 years in the reserves, where he worked on the RAAF's fifth-generation Air Force strategy and subsequently the Joint Force Plan Aurora integration strategy. John is today the chair of the Institute for Integrated Economic Research, Australia, where he has been leading the Institute's National Resilience Project since 2019. He also advises government agencies and companies on defense and national security, national resilience, and the implications of emerging technologies such as AI. Welcome to the program, John.
Thank you very much, Roland. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, John, yes, for joining us. As a senior leader in critical Western national security establishment, how and when did you first start thinking about artificial intelligence?
Well, Charles, it's about 25 years ago.
Wow.
We didn't call it artificial intelligence. So in the late 1990s, one of my jobs was Secretary of Defence Commander for basically looking at the defence in Northern Australia. And when we were doing very large-scale exercises and war games, we had a real problem. How do we make sense of a very large dynamic data set with information gaps, potential system attacks upon us? And one of the things we wanted to say, well, what is normal? We had so much information coming in. Can we have some way of having normalcy data? Tell us when something out of the normal is happening or it looks like we might be being attacked. And we started to talk about what is now called a digital twin. So we wanted to create a digital model of our system, one of the adversary, and then look at experimenting on attacking them or them attacking us. What did the system look like? Because we were having a lot of problems, just basic technical. We brought so much data into the system, for example, from civil air traffic control systems. How did we know that data wasn't manipulated? But we had quite a few system errors. It took 10 years after that to get a basic normalcy data system in place. The problem wasn't just technology, is that when that was developed by our scientists and industry, you couldn't inject it into our command and control system because that had been built by a company as a project. And we didn't have open architectures or any of these things. So it was a real challenge, not only to recognize a problem, but find a way of how to insert that into a procurement or management system for capabilities of stovepipes. If I step back to more recent times, in the last few years as a reservist, thinking about AI and what defense was doing, there's a lot of machine-based learning tools coming into place, very basic concept demonstrators. But what they're doing is like injecting little pieces to see what it's like, ignoring that one of our major problems in modern defense systems is the integration at the system level. How does the whole thing come together? And I think the other one is a concern that a lot of people don't really understand much about this yet. It's an emerging technology. Some of the AI startups I've worked with are brilliant on the AI technology, but they don't understand the context or environment we're trying to apply the AI to actually have some effect. And what that means is the data sets they use might be technically correct, but they miss out on things like, well, what's the culture or the training system that we're trying to actually apply AI to? But also, I think we have to really recognize that the limitations of where we are. I think about military platforms like fifth generation. We use that talk a lot. The AI systems that we're trying to introduce are Wright brothers level, the first generation. And we've got to really understand what that difference means, and don't assume because it's a fifth generation platform that the AI on board is the same generational capability.
That does sound like quite a challenge. Not only are you adapting your existing system to use this new widget for which it was not designed to play along with, you also have to figure out how to buy it. How do you do this through procurement? In addition to the operational questions and doctrine and rules of engagement and all of that stuff, you got to be able to buy it. That must have been a huge challenge.
Let's think back to the start of the last century. I mean, probably knew how to buy balloons, but someone has this flying machine and go, hang on, this just doesn't fit into any of the model. And that's the other issue is that, that we're all getting really excited with ChatGPT at the moment and running around with our hair on fire because something almost sounds coherent. But we've got to recognize some of the basics. So I had a little bit of fun yesterday. I tapped into the ChatGPT. Why are the Chinese sending surveillance balloons over the USA? And it's a wonderfully coherent response. It said, I'm not aware of any reports of Chinese surveillance balloons being deployed over the USA. It is possible you may have heard misinformation or misinterpreted information, which I think is a bit unfair because I know their databases only go to 2021. But we've got to understand the limitations of what they've been programmed to do. So apparently the balloons are misinformation or misinterpreted.
Had our share of creative information over the years.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I absolutely see your point, because the training of some of these models might take days or weeks and a whole lot of power, and that might be one of the many challenges you're going to have integrating this not necessarily real-time technology into a very real-time environment.
Yeah. So in some ways, if you're trying to do massive data, as we have to right now with the computing power, you almost have to think in an Air Force sense of having airborne nodes with incredible connectivity. And that might be doing the AI functioning and purely providing the results like a thin client to the other aircraft or platforms. But what you've got to do there is you've got to rethink your architecture of how you actually construct your force, deploy it, and use it. And when you don't design a force as an integrated architecture, you just buy the pieces, that's going to be an even bigger challenge with AI.
And once again, the pieces that were not necessarily designed for to play nice with the other components as well as in that particular environment. So I'd ask about procurement and doctrine.
Yeah.
Have you made progress in these areas? Are we figuring it out?
I don't think so. Look, I've had a look at the US DoD directive on DT&E and OT&E for autonomy and weapon systems. And when you read it, it's a good attempt at taking existing policy and saying, well, what is the difference now we're trying to do? And it has statements that you'll go through rigorous hardware and software V&V and realistic development. Yeah, that sounds great. My background as well as fighters was as a test pilot, so I've done a lot of DT&E and OT&E work. And it says technologies and data sources that are transparent to auditable by and explained by relevant personnel. Now, it's a wonderful aspiration, but let's just do a reality check here. We're going to end up with systems that can't explain themselves. The bit I liked also where it said the DoD personnel will exercise appropriate levels of judgment and care while remaining responsible for the development, deployment, and use of AI. We can't do that, frankly, with current historical technologies. So once again, I said, okay, well, how will DoD personnel do it? So I put that into ChatGPT as well. So how would an AI program tell us how defense personnel will exercise judgment? And it came back and it was interesting. It sounded pretty good. They'll exercise appropriate levels of judgment and establish ethical principles, will ensure they're transparent, explainable. They'll conduct regular assessments to make sure it's functioning as intended, and it's aligned with DoD values. Now, when I read this, I said the AI system seems to be scooping up reams of corporate speak and banalities, and it repackages them in some form of coherent sentence, which excites us, that I think allows shallow individuals to regurgitate rather than actually think for themselves. And that's the early trap. We'll get, so excited, I don't have to think, I'll use it. So the guidelines at the moment, understandably, are simplistic. I don't think they're really feasible. I thought to myself, perhaps an AI system actually wrote the policy itself, but I'm not going to be that cruel. But the real problem then comes back is that you've got procurement and military systems. And in Australia, in 2015, there was a major review of our defence organisation. It said, look, you can't build a current or future generation defence force just by buying lots of projects and hoping they integrate through data links or something later on. You've got to build a system. Our Defence Department has not been able to implement the recommendation from that 2015 report. So what we've got, and I would be surprised if it was very different in the US, the culture is project focused, not program or system. Few inside the bureaucracy, apart from the deep experts, really understand this. But is that something unusual? No. In 2017, I did a year's work on integrated air and missile defence, both as a reservist, but also as a think tank. And I started to realise very few people who said IAMD understood exactly the complexity of the system, and therefore all they would ever be able to do is buy little pieces. When you look at these areas, and AI is just the latest example, we're not going to be able to do much about implementing testing without significant changes to synthetic environments to test at scale. Because what we were trying to do is identify existing and emergent behaviours in systems, and you can't ever test that in the real world. Not unless you go and sit in the middle of the Ukraine right now and watch what's going on, but you've got to take a whole different approach to DT and OT and E. And of course, there's huge risk in doing that as well.
John, from my experience in advising militaries during testing of weapon systems, the big challenge is what happens if things fail. And listening to you describing the sort of stovepipe development, the lack of system conception, and the failure to be doing the kinds of things you recommended several years ago, if a new AI system doesn't seem to work or can't be integrated, is the likely result that the military will default to the previous generation, or to push on and somehow try to make it work?
This comes back to another cultural issue, which is risk aversion. If you're a senior officer in a position, you don't want anything to fail whilst you're there. So you can get this risk aversion, and they defer the problems to the next guy. Look, I think we've got to be risk
watch syndrome, as we call it.
There's a risk of that. Or what they'll do, and I've seen this happen even in recent times, when you talk about a complex system problem, the answer back is, look, we're going to fix this piece here because I can do that whilst I'm in the job in the next 2 years. I'm going to do that. That's where I'm going to focus my team. But nobody's looking at the bigger picture. The question is how do you know if you succeed or fail? Let's be honest about it. The failure rates with humans in the decision-making process are quite significant. We accept that in some ways. We lament it, but we accept it because we're humans. In my view, we've got to look at this in a different way of developing it, and we can talk about that a little later. But when the failure rates of AI start to come down to the failure rates of humans operating in a complex combat environment, to me, that's fairly good success. We've got to make sure we don't think this thing is going to be perfect or whatever. It's designed by humans. It's developed by humans. And so you're going to have to do this. But as I said, the only way we're going to explore this is basically in complex digital twins and very complex synthetic environments. And we're going to have to accept that we need red teams established, not just for an exercise, but continuously to work out how we'd attack ourselves, how we attack an adversary, because in this case, it's so much more subtle where you can start to interfere with data sets and how the neural engines are actually being trained and things. If you could fiddle at that level, very hard to detect. So I think we have to be realistic. The idea that we're going to have a perfect system, no, that ain't going to happen because that's not the real world.
So you basically have sort of established sort of a spectrum between the ideal, which is, as you sort of say, not achievable, and we're used to being imperfect because we are.
Yeah.
Okay. And in some sense where we are today, which is, not great. One of the things that immediately makes me wonder about is, are the adversaries that we are thinking about today, or the ones that we don't know about that might come along next year, are those adversaries in any better shape in terms of adapting or applying or acquiring this technology than we are?
I don't think so. Look, over the decades, let's put it this way, we in militaries have had the tendency to inflate the capacity of the adversary, based on looking at how many platforms they have or how many people they have. The fact that they could be a complete cluster and not able to operate because they like if you look at the Russians, so hierarchically dependent, they kill innovation and they become incredibly inflexible, or some other cultures that we'd be worrying about now. And you look at how do they think, how do they make decisions? We tended to inflate this in the past for the reasons of saying why we have to have the latest fifth generation, this or that. They're as complete confused. And I think the advantage we have in the West, if we allow it to work, is the innovation, the contest of ideas, the dynamics in some of the younger generations, as long as we don't squash it. And I think in some of the adversary areas, whether it's you're talking about Russia or China, I think they have a cultural disadvantage in one way, but a national discipline advantage in another to execute their goals. So, no, I don't think anyone's better off than us, because introducing this type of thing requires a lot of debate, investigation, and innovation. And that's an area in the West that we could exploit if we're prepared to.
Well, let me pick up where you left off. Western militaries have reportedly gotten much more comfortable with bottom-up strategies in recent years. I could have made the same statement in 1944 based on the way soldiers innovated out in the field. And we've been reading a lot in the press of how innovative Ukrainian forces have been, which I take it the U.S. and Australia are monitoring closely to see, because that instead of digital red teams, this is the real thing. Do you feel that bottom-up collaboration among troops on the ground has developed leadership acceptance for this mode of work? I know in Australia, for example, if there's a new bit of kit, it often goes first to the special forces. And if they find that it works, then the other branches try to get in on it. But if you could give us a sense, at least on your side, whether that's because it was a bottom-up collaboration or a contractor sold it to somebody on the top.
I think it's a mixture. The majority of big system developments obviously come from contractors. They've been through huge amounts of testing. How you use that new capability in an innovative way gets really interesting. So I think this bottom-up collaboration has to be there. It varies depending on what's happening in the organization. When I was doing the mentoring of the plan, Air Force's Plan Jericho, which is a fifth-generation Air Force plan, we were looking at how do we do rapid innovation and how do we go somewhere. So the top-down design model that happened, you say, well, here's the requirement, the concept, here's the concept of operations with limited scenarios, do a gap analysis. Now we work out a program of work says, okay, we've come top-down and we've looked at this, now go off for the next 2 years and implement it. But what you end up doing with that is you end up being reactive to system failures or problems without anticipating or exploring them. So with Jericho, what we did is, okay, let's not get the generals to lead the fifth generation plan. So what I proposed to the chief was we would get 206s, colonel equivalents. We put them together with a small team and we'd get them to go and look at, opportunities, technology, and in perhaps small vignettes, look at how you could use these in different ways in a future operational environment. And the idea was to give them freedom to experiment, to go outside the boundaries and say, well, using what we've already got plus this other stuff, we could do this quite different to what we currently do. And what we wanted to do is start to define the characteristics of this future force so it allows us to be far more effective, and inject that into the top-down system so that when we're doing a gap analysis, we weren't only gap analysing on what the problem was today, we were seeing what the problem could be. This worked reasonably well for a couple of years in that particular mix of leadership that we had at the time. But as we started to define all these things that needed to happen, then we had some new leadership come in who said, well, I've got this list of things to do. Now let's all just focus on the next 3 years to implement this list of things that we want to do, rather than keeping that innovation process running in parallel. It's difficult to do, but I think if you don't do it, you become reactive, narrow, and you actually limit the potential of your force. So it's absolutely essential.
John, we've heard from experts in other fields on the program that there are two challenges to the adoption of AI or an AI-enhanced product. One is the trust deficit. For example, will the operators trust an AI system if it's introduced into their cockpit, or an aircraft that's working with them that's AI operated rather than having a human pilot? Another is the loss of skills normally gained through that kind of experience. Surgeons using AI, especially if they're trained with it, may not do the kinds of things an experienced surgeon would have done because they're relying on the AI to do it, and they may be missing things that the AI is missing. What is your thinking on this, especially as applied to AI in the military field?
Yeah. I've been listening to a podcast where the ghostwriter of Nelson Mandela's autobiography got the tapes that he recorded when he was speaking to Nelson Mandela. And at one stage in there was a comment that he made, and I'll sort of paraphrase it. It said, you can't really find out if a person is trustworthy until you trust them. Because if you don't trust them at the start, you'll never find out if they are trustworthy. And I really thought about that. So I thought, well, how do you apply this to AI? I think we've got to think of a spectrum of simple processes to complex and risk levels. And so if it's a simple process or decision, then go through your verification piece, and then you have to say, well, I'm going to trust this. It's a simple process. It's a lot of noise. It's a lot of activity. If I can take it off the human decision maker, it will help us focus on the more complex problems. So I think there's an area where we should be trusting it, where it can be quite defined. If you get it into a complex dynamic environment and systems, then I think we've got to take a slightly different area. I'd always have a degree of distrust. But mind you, when we moved from the Mirage to the F-18 fighters, we treated the F-18 systems in those days, in the 80s, with a degree of distrust. And I'll come back to explain why in a moment. So what we have to do is treat it differently. Take it as an advice, but have the human layer in there looking through their experience and context to say, does this make sense? Is there a disconnect here? And you have to think about it being advisory rather than a decision authority. That means that your command and control systems get interesting because you often have a yearly or even 2 yearly software update. Think about your iPhone. I accept the update because I trust it. These things don't work at times. What we found in some of our complex systems was a multi-layer software system. And so with one of our huge sensor programs we were running a series of software layers where you could introduce a new capability at, say, a layer above, work it with the operations. If something was concerned, you very simply, with almost a flick of the switch, revert back to the previous layer. So you didn't have to reload all the software. So what you had was a complex software management system where for, say, 90% of it, it's running as it was. We're going to introduce new capability and watch it very carefully. If there's anything at all, we immediately revert back to the known running system. And it was a very flexible system. I think we need something like that with this. You don't want to be stuck in like with an airplane where the annual software update happens. It's been through the whole process. It won't work. We're going to have to do it differently. On the loss of skills through experience, in the Mirage days, this is the Mirage 3 when I started flight flying, it really was basic. There was no inertial navigation system. There's no GPS. We had sort of navigation instruments that were very imaginary. They didn't do much for us. So everything you did, you kept in your head. You had to have a mental picture of where you were. And when you're running around at 480 knots, 540 knots at times, very fast. But you also need to be able to calculate how to get to a particular place, say plus or minus 15 seconds, so you don't blow other people up when you're doing combined strike. What we found is that when we introduced the F-18 in the mid-80s, the folks who'd flown the Mirage kept that same mental model. And so when we had some system problems in the early days of the F-18, you went, well, that doesn't make sense. But when we brought new pilots into the system, they saw these wonderful displays. Well, they must be right. Like we hear of people driving Google Maps into a pond or something. And we did see a difference there without keeping that mental back. So I think what we saw then was the start of a loss of analytical or deductive skills that then presents a concept or a framework of how the world works, which then gives you what you feel is intuition. It's not, it's just pattern matching. And this is, I think, the risk with this. The education that we're going to have to give people and the experience and training that we should be doing, I think, in virtual environments to understand how to use the tools is going to be the fundamental piece. It's going to happen. You're not going to push back on AI, but the use of it intelligently is going to be our biggest problem, because I don't think our education systems are doing really well in some areas already, and this is going to make it harder.
John, you remind me that I once learned certain navies and their submarines have the captain observing the executive officer developing a firing solution in reliance on the computer, but the captain is calculating it in his head to check the computer's accuracy.
It is, and that's what you need to train. I mean, there is a logic that when you fly fighters or strike aircraft, you either fly at 420, 480, or 540 knots, or perhaps 600 knots. They're all multiples of 60. So what you're doing is it miles per minute. So when you need to adjust something, you go, well, I need to go from, I'm 2 miles behind, so I need to do this for 2 minutes. So it's very simple maths in your head, but you've got it in place. The 60 is magic thing because, 1 degree at 60 miles is 1 nautical mile. So if you need to change this, is that you've got this maths going in your head the whole time. Sounds a bit simple, but you fly in these ways that you can use mental maths. We're going to have to think about that, of how we look at the world. What is that mental processing? Because to me, the most powerful thing is, humans working together with their own concepts. And this is why airliners, this idea from some business managers that you could put one pilot in the cockpit because all the automated systems will take care of you, is mad. The value in an airliner when things go wrong is you've got two brains in there with competing ideas. And a good friend of mine was the captain of the A380 that the engine blew up after takeoff out of Changi. And they had 5 very experienced pilots in the cockpit. And systems just started to fail everywhere. How they got it back up and saved everyone's lives is amazing. But when those systems started to fail, there is no way that a single person in that environment could have dealt with it, no matter how great the existing technology at the time. So I think this is the thing, is how do we keep those skills in place, and how do we train people to use tools intelligently, not slavishly?
I'd be interested for your thoughts on this, as you were talking about the trust deficit and sort of the spectrum from simple to complex, and then the loss of skills. You had said earlier in the discussion that, there's concern about a potential maybe default presumption or bias to assuming that because it involves computers, it is accurate or it is right. Yes. And as you were walking through those iterations of the question or your responses to Roland's question, it came to mind to me. Do you think that the national security establishment has that deep appreciation of the trust deficit and the loss of skills, and how you cannot just assume because a computer or machine learning is involved that it's going to be right or it's going to be accurate? Is there enough understanding to push back appropriately when those situations come up?
In pockets. So I think if you look at, let's say in a society of the natural distribution, you've probably got 5 or 10% of people who are really attuned to all this sort of stuff. The advantage in America is that you have, 270 million people? In Australia, we have 26. So that 10% You folks have probably got 30 million really brilliant, absolutely brilliant people. If you look at the same statistics, we've got 3. So yes, I think when I look at the discussion happening in the US in the think tank areas or these other areas, yeah, you've got enough people doing it. As you go to smaller organizations, it gets problematical because, I've been in strategic policy areas in government, all this sort of stuff. The majority of people are, good, intelligent people, but they're working a process. And the process they work is take the last iteration of the strategy, make a couple of tweaks, and then put it through a filter that's politically acceptable for the politician to say something. And so you become a slave of the past. It doesn't mean they're stupid. It means they're trapped with an organizational process and culture. And again, what I found in these areas, bureaucracies then also start to behave the way they're treated by the present government. So for the last 9 years, our government told our bureaucracy, you're there to provide information, not policy. And if you keep beating somebody over the head with that, it's like if you keep telling a child they're stupid, they behave that way. And there's not enough people thinking about this because the machine's running and doing what it did before. But there are enough people in our society, if we listen to them, and to do what you folks are trying to do here, get a different discussion going, bring other points out. So it's not a lost cause, but the bureaucracies, I think, in some ways have become self-limiting.
So your comments about developing trust resonated very loudly to me in a related area. There's a famous problem in game theory called the prisoner's dilemma that I'm sure everybody knows. And what's interesting is that there was a famous mathematician named John Nash who came up with the most interesting way to address that by basically saying, well, this isn't a one-time game. It's actually a set of repeated games. And if you play it in a repeated game with a very simple strategy, namely whatever your opponent did last time, you do the next time, you create you actually get to a stable solution. And the interesting thing is that game theory insight it underpins things like the thing called I forget the exact name of it. It's for stability and security in Europe. OSCE, I think, is the name for it, which is basically developing trust over time by small tests. And that's precisely what you said in your comments on that. And I think that's the clear insight. As you say, you can't trust it totally instantly, but what you can do is you can build trust incrementally over time, and you can design that building of trust into your acquisition and onboarding processes for systems.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that.
John, let's take an example where it didn't sound, at least to me when I read about it, incremental, but a real technological leap from a country with, as you just got done saying, smaller numbers of really bright people, but clearly very capable. In the last year, I saw media reports of an unpiloted combat jet called Loyal Wingman, developed jointly by Boeing Australia, the Royal Australian Air Force, and numerous other companies. It's reported to be aimed at accompanying a piloted aircraft to perform, at the very least, reconnaissance and defensive tasks. Can you comment on Loyal Wingman's use of AI in this and the significance that the Department of Defense in the US has now arranged for Loyal Wingman to be brought here for additional testing?
Look, I think with the unmanned platforms, AI is going to have to be an essential part of it. There's no doubt whatsoever. And what we've seen here is that Boeing Australia, really taking the knowledge and everything out of the US, has done this development program in Australia at a small scale. I think they're doing it there primarily to avoid some of the ITAR problems. But of course, the US has its own development programs.
You've got to explain ITAR. Not everybody in the audience knows what that is.
It's the technology restrictions that go on the export of critical technologies for the United States. So when you look at these projects, there's a whole bunch of regulations and limitations that the US government has about what can and can't be exported, depending on which country it is and how it's used. So if you want to develop something within the US, then it will obviously have all those regulations and limits. If you want to develop something, say in Australia, it doesn't have the US ITAR regulations if it's not using US technology. And therefore, in a market sense, you could sell it to a lot of other regional countries. But let's not kid ourselves. This is a small-scale development here in Australia by a US company. And in parallel, there's massive stuff happening. So AI is absolutely essential, I think, in this. But as the comment I made earlier, the Loyal Wing is a great example of looking at a fifth-generation level integrated force design, producing a platform, hopefully with some low observability things about it, to work as an integrated one. But the technology they're going to put on that platform is Wright brothers level. It's first or second generation AI. So the trouble is we're going to be looking at a shiny thing that's operating with the JSF. Therefore, this must be the latest. And this it's like the equivalent of having a dog on board that barks if it sees something. Great start. We have to go there, but let's not get too excited. It's like getting excited about ChatGPT, and then when you lift the lid and go, it's just a dog. It's barking.
That reminds me, John, of the astonishment people had when they saw that the computers running the Apollo systems, the systems in the Apollo series of flights, had core memory, for example, and they were far behind modern systems, quote, quote. And of course, the explanation is, bleeding edge is nice, but it's really nicer if everybody else works out the bugs and we get to take it home.
Absolutely.
So, along those same lines, I've often heard that a modern fighter aircraft really can't be flown by a human, and that it has to make in the design, you have to make a boatload of accommodations. Don't freeze the pilot, don't asphyxiate the pilot, don't crush the pilot when you need to turn. Oh crap, we forgot that, so let's turn real fast. Oops. It seems like it just might be better if the squishy part wasn't in there.
I feel.
What do you think? Is it going to be flying remotely, or are we just not going to go there?
We have to head towards getting the humans out of the cockpit. So it's not only the limitations of the human, but the extra weight and systems you put on board this thing. You're never going to get a fighter pilot airplane unless it's got an ejection seat, I'll tell you. And that's a fairly big bit of weight. So look, the human in the cockpit to date has been the greatest strength, because the ability to make rapid, very, very quick decision-making, to work as a team with the other aircraft. But it's also the fundamental vulnerability in that, particularly in the early stages, a lot of working in that team was on the radio. Now, the radio can be jammed, but also you've got to say something and listen to each of you guys talk back to you. Where we're going with, particularly the JSF and the latest systems, where you've effectively got sensor fusion, communications that are very secure, and you're sitting in one aeroplane, but the sensors in all the other aeroplanes, it's as if you have them in your aeroplane as well. And that's where the huge leap has been. We have to get to where we do take the pilot out. Remotely piloted, it's fine for something like a Reaper or a Global Hawk or Triton. But the speed of decision-making and the environment we're going to be in, it's going to have autonomy. You can't make those decisions and act adequately without it. But what will happen is the tactics using remotely piloted vehicles or in those autonomous are going to be very, very different. When you haven't got the concern about having to get the pilot back, or if they eject, try and go and rescue them. So you don't need the CSAR stuff going. It'll change performance capacities, weights. Even with the best G suits, you don't want to be running around, above 8G. You'll have a whole bunch of other sort of problems with the pilots. But to be able to maneuver adequately in the complex environments, you need to do that. So no, we have to go that way. But we have to understand how those systems might be attacked by an adversary, so that we can ensure that they're not used back against us.
John, just a quick follow-up on that. One of the two things that humans do better than AI is they tend to recognize when something's amiss, something's, not right, at least from their perspective, and they tend to fail gracefully rather than just simply defaulting. In making this, getting the pilot out, what's the risk that we're going to be giving up that capability to say, I think I'm lost. I think this is not working. I can improvise.
I think you probably not valid, but I think you almost need a separate AI system on board the airplane. We used to joke that if you wanted a fully automatic airliner, you'd have the pilot and you'd have a dog, and the dog's job was to stop the pilot touching the controls and just leave it to the autopilot. And in this case here, you almost need that second system on the side here going, is this AI pilot lost the plot? Is there something that doesn't make sense? And so in my, I guess, traditional mind, the slight part of my mind that might be traditional, I'd be thinking about you want to have the checks and balances. So it's not a single AI system on board the airplane. It's like, you've got another system watching this going, this is going well off the rails. But by having a parallel system, it's going to be possibly hard to attack them both exactly at the same time. And that's what I like about the checks and balances, that we need to have a think in there. But yeah, keep the AI dog in the other seat, making sure that the other AI doesn't do something stupid.
Well, you raised an interesting point too when you said if we did do remote piloting or even just remote data feed, because maybe an autonomous jet wouldn't have sensor capabilities that a downrange or somebody on the ground or a satellite might have. But what about the risk, like you said, of someone interfering with that data feed? It's one thing to confuse a pilot and cut off his or her connection. They've got the creativity. It all comes back down to the failure and who's in charge, mistargeting and straying into the wrong airspace and violating this or that. Sounds like it's not going to happen soon.
No, I think, look, let's be real, AI is decades, a real AI, I'm pretty sure it's still decades away, as some of your previous discussions you've had on your podcast that I've been listening to. But it's not just an AI in the cockpit in this case, it's AI battle managers. So you're going to need other AI routines that do the job that a battle manager does today, which is looking at all that sensor coming in, the management of the various assets in the area. And that function all needs to go in that area as well. So you still have humans in the command centers, but the battle management and the dynamics of this working so rapidly with these other elements. But then you've got to come back and say, okay, I've seen AI systems that are very simple. It might be identifying this is a particular aircraft, so you've got disposable remote sensors you throw around the place. It does it from basic AI and it sends a very simple message back. I'm seeing this particular thing here as a sensor. So what you've got to then start thinking about is what information has to flow to and from those platforms in a complex environment, and what's the architecture of getting that information around. Because our way of thinking about data links today is not going to survive a high-threat environment. If you start to think about the potential of what could happen to satellite communications in a contested environment, you've got to have multiple layers, high bandwidth communication systems within the combat area. So you've actually got to take a whole architectural approach to say, I can come up with this wonderful autonomous platform driven by AI, but what's the architecture it fits into to do its job? And that's where I see a lot of information lagging, because I think the thinking about those architectures and battle space stuff is, I don't know, I'd say probably a decade behind the thinking about platforms, because you can sell platforms as a package. Talking about a battle space architecture, you've now got this, well, no, we've got multiple companies trying to do this, and it can't happen at a single service level. It's a joint issue. And the authority of joint military groups, even in the US and Australia, is variable, let's just say it, because of the culture of organizations. So the complex design problem I don't think has been properly looked at. I still work in that sort of space as a consultant, but it's very early stages on battle space architectures. And of course, let's learn the lesson, as probably the Ukrainians are learning now, when with the Starlink, they're now being told they can't be using Starlink for drone operations. So they've actually built up a model of what they're doing. And Elon the reports that Elon Musk comments or something about not allowing them to be used for offensive operations. So let's really understand all those complexities of the enabling architecture around the outside.
John, I want to ask you a couple of questions about protecting AI systems. But before I do, I'd like to ask you a more personal question. This is not my first conversation with you. And one of the things that I'm impressed by is how differently you think when you move to the next stage in your career. You were a fighter pilot. Then you were a deputy chief of the Air Force. Undoubtedly, when you stepped out of the cockpit, you started seeing things differently than you did when you were a fighter pilot, but you never gave up the experience you developed there. Now you've been out of the, command and control structure of the Royal Australian Air Force. You've been working in industry, and you seem to be much more reflective than I think somebody who's in that chain of command right now. Can you tell us how your own thoughts on AI have changed as you've moved through these different structures? In other words, do you now think you're in a better place to think about it, or do you wish you were back in where you were able to make the decisions?
Well, let's be honest about it. When you're back in the squadron, your decisions you're making are very narrow because they're about immediate environment. The thinking process happened is when I was a commanding officer of a fighter squadron, I did a master's on defense and strategic studies and started to think about not just the military part, but how a national security framework works, and realizing that we didn't have one. So that's what triggered it. The master's I did when I was a commanding officer of squadron. The second master's I did and the next rank level developed on that. But what happens once you get past colonel level, certainly in our military, you get so overloaded with process, politics, the system, that your ability to sit back and think and reflect is quite limited. When I got out from full-time service, and even though I was doing a huge amount of contracts as a consultant, I did a lot of work in think tanks, and I had the opportunity to educate myself. And so I started doing studies into things like logistics, space policies, a whole bunch of other weird stuff, and realized that despite the depth of expertise as a military officer, my understanding of how the world worked was very limited. So in the next 10 years, I spent a lot of time doing different studies as well as my consulting work. I started to learn about business, which you do as a consultant, everything from the large companies to the small. And then I came to the conclusion that most other people are so busy in their jobs, they don't have time to think either. So you have some academics who have time to think, but are not in the middle of the reality of, well, how the hell do you implement something? You have politicians who, unfortunately, most of whom, there's some brilliant ones, but most of them are looking at the next 3 years. But you've got to then step back, take the time to educate yourself and rethink and just take your thinking up a level. And that's the journey I'm still on. When I had the opportunity to start working with small AI companies, I was asked by a defense organization to give them some mentoring advice. And then I had to look at what they were doing. I thought, brilliant in their area, but no understanding of context or the actual thing they're trying to work on. They're not stupid, they're very smart people. But that's where the education gap is. We educate in pieces. We have an industrial age policy, politics, and education model. Train them all in the bits. When they get out there, they'll sort it. So that was the opportunity, the journey. And the best thing I ever did is when I retired from full-time service is I never worked for a company again. I only worked as a consultant. Because once I've seen with my peers, you work for a company, you're now back on those railway lines again for the company's reasons. It's been an interesting journey. But it really comes back to is how do we educate and inform people to allow them to keep learning. If you stop learning any time in your life, I think you're missing out on something pretty important.
Well, I'm glad you gave that answer because I want you to speak from that perspective now on how confident you are in our capabilities to protect AI systems from adversaries. And to put that in context, the DoD directive says that before fielding an autonomous system, the DoD will verify, among other things, that system safety, anti-tampering mechanisms, cyber survivability, operational resilience, and cybersecurity capabilities have been implemented to minimize the probability and consequences of failure, and a monitoring regime will be in place to identify and address changes in the operational environment, which is probably going to be pretty dynamic, data inputs, and use that could contribute to such failures. Is that all aspirational, or do you see that as something that is incrementally possible, given the perspective you now see these things from?
I think we will stumble forward in small steps in reaction to failures, because we're in junior school, in my opinion, here. because the stovepiped approach to acquisition or systems therefore produces a stovepiped approach to threat that can mask potential system level problems. And so our vulnerability is in the gaps between our capabilities, not necessarily within the capabilities themselves. So when you look at the risk, I think data modifications is a huge risk. If an adversary can determine the data sets that are being used to build a particular system, then manipulate them, the consequences are really ugly, because despite what you might do in some DT&E and OT work in a narrow area, you get large-scale loss of confidence or trust in an AI-augmented system that's in use. Now you've got a problem, because once people lose confidence in that system, what do they do in the middle of a complex operational situation? What are the reversionary modes? So we have to design with a realistic look that there are going to be failures and mistakes. How do we actually think about managing those as we go along? And one of our biggest problems there is honesty, because when things start to go wrong, it's often a human nature to cover it up, or, oh, look, don't worry, it's under control. And governments don't want to spook their populations. So again, using security boundaries, which sometimes are overplayed, they don't inform the public. And so it actually compounds the problem. So I think we're going to have a hell of a mess as we go into this, because we have a naive belief in technology on the one side, a shallowness in thinking in general, which is being driven even more that way with social media and TikTok and all this other stuff. And I think AI will actually amplify that in our society. It's like turning the volume up to 11, to use an analogy of a very old cynical movie. This is going to actually amplify the shallowing of thinking and the consequences in our society, where our responsibility is now, those who want to think about this, is how do we deal with that journey we're going to be on? Because it is a reality that we're going to go here. We do need AI. It's going to be a very difficult transition journey in a society that's largely distracted to shallow issues. So on the one hand, I think we've got the brains to do it. But man, it's going to be a difficult transition.
I can't help but ask you this question. Given the competition between adversaries right now, or peer competitors, to put it differently, do you think we're better investing in systems that defeat and compromise the adversary's AI system rather than trying to build one that they can't do that to us on?
I don't think we'll ever build one that can't do us on. So therefore, you've got to counter it. My biggest concern would be, is not in the sense of military operations, is the use of AI to reduce confidence and, self-belief in a society. So you look at the reported use of Russians and Chinese in terms of elections, whether it's in England or America. You look at the manipulation of media, the manipulation of interest groups, that AI will only allow this, and particularly some of the fake AI-generated capability. This is going to amplify and drive the divisions in our society. And I think that is a much bigger risk than the AI implications in a military sense, because without cohesion in our society, without a degree of belief or trust in what's happening, then Western societies can fragment very, very rapidly. To me, that's the big threat, not the military part of it. Yes, there's a lot of complexity in the military, but the military, I think, is the hammer. But if you've got no idea how to use that hammer, or no willingness to use that hammer because your society is imploding, that is, I think, the national security risk that we're facing in the next few decades.
That sounds like what the grid operators face when there start to be cascading outages and they lose situation awareness and trust in what awareness they still have.
So when I think about potential roles of AI in our society, what came out of the National Resilience Project we've been doing for the last few years is we postulated 3 aspects in society that are important. I just ripped these off in the military, and then we started looking at civil society. And we said there's 3 things that make our society resilient. Improve situational awareness. That means you've got to assist in clearing the fog of war, not only in a military sense, but in society. You need to have near real-time assessments of the situation, emerging risks and opportunities, again, not just for the military, but for society. You have to be honest with your population, say, look, this is the reality of the world. Yet things are messy, but hey, we've got a problem. That's number 1, situational awareness. Number 2, you need to use AI to help teaming ability and performance. None of our societal problems can be handled by an entity or an individual or a political party. We're only going to deal with the challenges that we face in the next decades, whether it's economic, environmental, conflict, energy, So we have to work as a team, but we're not good at supporting and enabling teaming because there's this competition stuff half the time. If you have shared awareness and you have their teaming ability, the third one, again from the military, is preparedness and mobilization. My experience in preparedness and military assessments, they were always made after the fact where we had failed in something. And you'd sit in these chiefs committee meetings, finding someone to blame for something that had gone wrong in our preparedness last year. We've got to shift that and look at preparing, again, not just for military, but for the inevitable problems we're going to face with energy transition or climate. We need to think about how AI can help us understand the changing situation, the emerging risk, rather than the threat, and say, well, how do we better prepare for it and track our preparedness? And the last one is mobilization. We mobilized before World War II pretty effectively. I can't think where we've mobilized ever since. And when you think of the scale of the challenges we face in society, we have to mobilize our society to act, which means we can't all keep living necessarily to the same standard and freedom that we have, being very cautious about those words. But if you mobilize to deal with an existential threat, which is some of the issues we're facing, then frankly, the complexity of that, we're going to have to think about how would you use AI to help you understand that. So situation awareness, teaming, preparedness, mobilization. And that's the line that we're pushing. And what I'm most pleased to see in Australia is the discussions that are now happening. We're having our first national risk assessment will be coming out in the middle of 2023. And that will be an ongoing annual process. We don't have a national security strategy, but as we've pointed out in our work for the last few years, you can't have a national security strategy if you haven't got a national risk assessment, because what's the strategy for? But the government's taken this on. There's groups of us who are involved behind the scenes with that. So I have a degree of optimism. Understand your risk, be honest about it, and then let's get on and do something about it. AI could play a great role there, but the people developing AI are technically brilliant in a very narrow area. You've got to understand the context of society and the problems we face at a society level to work out how do we apply it there. If you don't do that, I don't care how good your military is, it's not going to be of value to us if your country's fallen apart.
Well, let me just say, John, listening to your comments, I have learned a lot, but I'm also, as I've always been in conversations with you, extraordinarily impressed with how articulate and clear you are about what you're thinking.
Well, thanks. And look, I'm still optimistic. The sort of conversations we're having are happening in a lot of places. So we've got a lot of smart people. It's just trying to nudge society in the right direction. But thanks, Roland. Thanks, folks, for the opportunity to talk to you today. It's great. And I'll keep listening to your podcast. There's some really interesting stuff coming out of this.
Well, thank you very much. We were honored to have you as a guest.
Much appreciated.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We thank the business law section of the American Bar Association for their generous sponsorship of the production of this podcast. We welcome questions and comments from listeners. Send email to comments@mindthegapdialogues.com. We read all comments and questions and will try to respond in the letters section of a future episode. If you are writing about a particular episode, please do mention the specific episode number. Please also do include pronunciation tips to help us properly say your name when we reply in a subsequent episode. See you next time on Mind the Gap Dialogues on AI.
Thank you for listening to the ABA Business Law Section's podcast series, To the Extent That. The section offers a robust collection of content. To explore more about this topic, or to learn about joining the section, visit ambar.org/bizlaw. That's BIZLAW.